welcome to Jeta in Kosovë. I am calling you because it's exactly 20 years since the Rambouillet Agreement was signed in January 1999, 20 years since Rachak massacre happened, then in February Rambouillet Agreement, then in March it will be 20 years since the NATO bombing started. So looking at all of this, what happened is that eventually, as you know, Kosovo delegation put the ink to paper in Rambouillet agreement. Serbia delegation didn't show up. The rest is history. NATO started airstrikes. Looking back, was there any room for diplomacy at that time?
Well, my own view of this is that if you're going to prevent a conflict, you need to start early, and the earlier you start, the more successful you're going to be. So looking back over all of this from 20 years into the future, as it were, my view is that we should have dealt with the Kosovo issue when we were at Dayton rather than at Rambouillet. Your viewers will know, of course, that it was the Dayton conference that put an end to the war in Bosnia. And I honestly believe that as the Dayton agreement was signed in 1995 and NATO troops for the first time went out of area, and you remember were the peacekeeping force in Bosnia for many years, it was at that time, 1995, that we should have said to Milosevic, look, we're not going to tolerate any more ethnic cleansing campaigns in the Balkans, not just in Bosnia, but in other territories. So drawing a line in the sand would have, I think, been appropriate in 1995. Second is that, of course, the tensions in Kosovo were going on for a long time before the violence started in the spring of 1998, and we had to go to Rambouillet. And then, of course, as you say, we had the NATO air campaign. And again, that was 4 years between Bosnia and between Kosovo. And I think in those 4 years, our diplomacy should have been more active to put pressure on Belgrade to restore the autonomy of Kosovo, which was taken away by Milosevic, of course, and to work for the integration of the communities. So my sense is once the conflict started, we really didn't have many good options. But we should have made more of the time between 95 and 98 to bring about a peaceful solution then.
Thank you for that perspective. Considering that you were the most watched person during that NATO campaign, certainly me and my family waited for your updates every day. And some people, my viewers, may have not have seen you since then. Can you just update them? Where are you now? What's Shea doing now?
Well, first of all, as you can see, I'm still alive, which is always the most important thing. I have retired from NATO because, unfortunately, I hit the mandatory retirement age of 65. So I've had to start a new life, firstly as a university professor. I'm the professor of strategy and security at the University of Exeter in the UK. So I'm having a great time boring all of my young people who are my students. And the other part of my time, as you can see from this screen behind us, is that I'm a senior fellow here in Brussels at a very well-known Brussels think tank called Friends of Europe. So not in NATO, but still alive and kicking.
Well, great, because to my benefit, now that you are retired, maybe you can tell me a little bit more that if we were to find cablograms one day, what would they say of the procedures of starting the airstrikes? One member state pushing for airstrikes, another hesitating. Could you tell us a bit more what was going on behind the scenes on those days just before the airstrike started? Was there a dilemma, or it was a pretty unified position?
Well, NATO genuinely remained united throughout the campaign because you have your debates before you decide to use force. But once you use force, the credibility of NATO, of course, is on the line. And if NATO does not succeed, everybody suffers as a result. So genuinely, the alliance was very united throughout the air campaign. We were never in a situation where one ally put its hand up in the NATO Council and said, I've had enough, I want to stop this operation, I'm leaving.
Weren't there some peace plans circulating during the campaign? attempts to stop the campaign. Russia became very active with its envoy, Viktor Chernomyrdin, that time.
Well, first of all, there were some debates about whether we should have a pause in the air campaign to allow, for example, humanitarian aid to be delivered. But the view that prevailed, the majority view, was that to stop the air campaign would lift the pressure off the Serbs, off Milosevic. There was no guarantee. Look what happened in Bosnia, that the humanitarian convoys would arrive and would reach, of course, the Albanian community hiding in their cellars and hiding in their houses. And so there was a belief that although the air campaign was perhaps longer than we had hoped, everybody hoped that it would succeed after 24, 48 hours. But everybody knew that NATO unity, sticking together, was the best guarantee of success. NATO unity was worth 1,000 air strikes, quite frankly. Secondly, the Russians came in as the result of American diplomacy. The State Department worked with the UN envoy, Marty Ahtisaari, and they together brought the Russians in because the Russians had an interest, of course, in stopping this as quickly as possible, naturally with a view to preserving the Milosevic regime, which could come under greater pressure the longer this went on. And also because it was seen, I think, by the United Nations and by NATO that having the Russians in would also give Milosevic a face-saving device to agree to meet NATO's conditions. But it wasn't the Russians who were going it alone. Chernomyrdin was very quickly integrated into a US-led effort, which I think is why ultimately we were successful. But of course, you mustn't forget that it was the mixture of the air campaign, the military pressure from NATO, and the diplomacy that eventually brought success. One alone, without the other, would not have produced a result. So Frederick the Great, you remember the famous 18th century ruler of Prussia, he said, diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments.
And I want to bring you back. You may be bored talking about this, the moment when Russian troops entered the Pristina airport. But I've got to tell you that that was the most heart-wrenching moment for majority of us who were made refugees. I was a journalist at that time. In that moment, sitting in Kukas, filing reports, waiting to come back. Tell me, what were you thinking when you saw those troops there? And can you explain how they made it there first?
Well, first of all, it was a shock for all of us, not just for you sitting in Kukës or for the Albanian community, of course, coming out of their bunkers and their shelters finally in Kosovo. We didn't anticipate it. I remember very well that I was at a lunch with the NATO Secretary General, Javier Solana, at his residence. It was the end of the air campaign. We were very tired. We were relieved that NATO had been successful and freedom finally was coming to the Kosovars. And then suddenly General Clark, Wes Clark, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, came on the phone and said, put down your wine glasses, stop your lunch. You have to get back to NATO headquarters right away because there's a Russian column which has left the NATO force. The Russians were with us at that time, still in Bosnia as part of the NATO force. And that force now is heading on the roads directly to Pristina with the aim, we thought, of sort of grabbing northern Kosovo or taking a sector. And so it was a tense 24 hours, as we know. The real problem, though, to my mind, was not the Russian column. It was too small. It was too lightly armed to really be able to influence the situation by itself. The real danger that we had on that particular day was the worry that the Russians would send in Spetsnaz forces, special forces, more forces, directly from Russia over Eastern Europe and into Kosovo to reinforce the Russian troops that had moved. So we would be dealing with a much larger Russian contingent, which could occupy the northern part of Kosovo or a whole sector. Think of Berlin during the Cold War, you remember, with an eastern sector and a western sector and a dividing line, a wall. this is something that clearly we did not want. But fortunately for us,
how come such a force? You didn't have intelligence that this was possibly going to happen?
Well, no, frankly, we didn't. We were focused, as you can imagine, very much on the withdrawal of the Serb forces, according to the agreement in Kumanovo between General Jackson and the Serb commanders, and ensuring that the Serb forces withdrew, as they promised, all of their heavy equipment, all of their MUP forces in an orderly way. And so this did come as a surprise, it's true. But just to finish this, the good news is that just before the Kosovo campaign began, 3 new countries joined the alliance. The Czech Republic, Poland and Hungary, and together with other NATO partners in the region, they closed their airspace, which made it impossible for Yeltsin, the Russian leader, to send Russian reinforcement troops to Kosovo. Of course, it all had a happy ending. The Russians were,
just tell me, did they want to send troops through
yes.
these 3 countries?
Yes, they did. The plans were for the Russians to then airlift additional forces into Kosovo. But as I say, fortunately, NATO allies...
So how did you remind us, how did you convince the Russians to withdraw from Pristina Airport?
Well, essentially what had happened is that General Jackson, the commander, of course, of KFOR, the Kosovo force, immediately after June 1999, he was going to use the airport in Pristina for his base, his headquarters. But the Russians arrived there first because he was still moving his forces up through the country that we now happily call North Macedonia, and which agreed this week to become a new member of NATO. So that's a good news story. One of your neighbors, of course, to the south. He, when he entered Kosovo, had the Russians already at the airfield. And so he had 2 choices: either tell the Russians to get out and risk an ugly confrontation, or to go somewhere else. And I know Mike Jackson, he's a very wise, very clever British general, and he knew very well that a couple of 100 Russians in 35, 38 degrees heat, it's very hot in Kosovo during the summer, at the airfield would run out of water, would run out of food very quickly, and would need to cooperate with the NATO forces. And so he just left them there.
You think, knowing of Mike Jackson, little that we do, he didn't offer some glasses of vodka to make it all right?
Well, they needed water before they needed vodka, even if vodka is the Russian word for water, but it's a special kind of water, as we all know. So no, I think Jackson played it brilliantly. He recognized that the best thing to do to salve the Russian pride, the Russian ego, if you like, the best thing to do was simply to say to Russia, okay, you want to roll in Kosovo, you want to be part of KFOR, you want to be here, fine, run the airfield. Don't have a sector north of the Ibar in Mitrovica, which would have been dangerous, as I've said, the Berlin scenario. You want to have a role? Run the airfield, Slatina airfield. And I will go up the hill to what we call Film City, where KFOR have been ever since. And that arrangement worked perfectly well.
But did they run, excuse me, but they as far as I remember, they didn't run the airport.
They did for a while, absolutely.
They did for a while. They ran the airport?
They withdrew eventually, of course, because I think it became too expensive for them even to keep a small force there. But initially, yes, they had immediately after June 1999.
How many weeks are we talking about? Months that they ran the airport?
Oh, a couple of months. I'd have to look at my history books, but they did. Eventually, as I say, the expense, the cost, the fact that their role was so small, politically made it unattractive for them. But it got us around a potentially ugly crisis in June 1999, as the peace agreement, the Serb withdrawal, was being implemented.
So, having dealt with that crisis, I remember shots of you walking around Pristina with Javier Solana, people cheering you. What do you feel about that now, compared to everything else you've experienced since, 20 years since?
Well, this undoubtedly was one of the greatest moments of my life. And indeed, when I left NATO back last September, as I mentioned, I had to retire from the organization because of my advanced age. My colleagues did a video, made a video.
You don't look that advanced. You
well,
don't look that advanced.
Appearances can be deceiving, right? But my colleagues at NATO made a very nice video about my career in the alliance, and one of the biggest moments of that video was the footage, the film footage of that crazy day, as you say, when we had the walkabout in downtown Pristina with Solana, with Wes Clark, the Jackson, the NATO commanders, and suddenly out of nowhere, thousands of Kosovars emerged, recognized us, and gave us that fantastic welcome. And for me, it was the vindication, the total vindication of everything that we tried to achieve during the air campaign to bring freedom, of course, back to the Kosovars. The other thing, though, frankly, was that it was a surprise for me because when we had the media campaign, during the air campaign, we thought that we were basically talking to Belgrade, we were talking to the NATO countries, we were talking to Russia. We had no idea, frankly, that the people of Kosovo were listening in on the radio or had access to the TV footage.
Why did you have that idea? Why do you think you wouldn't have been listened to by the people who waited for NATO bombing, who cheered it?
It's a good question. I think that one of the reasons is that we didn't have NATO forces on the ground, even in a clandestine mode, to act as, if you like, air spotters. The journalists were not there either. They were only allowed into Kosovo when Milosevic had one of his propaganda exercises, like after the Jakovica tractor convoy, that kind of thing. And I'll be honest with you, we thought that maybe the Kosovars, being in hiding in their cellars, obviously in a very, very stressful situation, may not have had access to TV or radio. I think also, frankly, the social media, the things now that dominate our lives, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, the things that allow us to know what people are thinking and where they are, these things were in their infancy. If the Kosovo campaign took place today, we would have a much better way of communicating with the Kosovars via the social media. But remember, this was 20 years ago. This was 1999. And it was just the beginning of the internet and the social media.
Yes. You rightly talk about Milosevic's propaganda, but I want to ask you now that you're out of NATO, how much did you have to lie yourself when you were coming out there every day in a press conference?
You may not want to believe this, but I'm going to tell you this with total conviction. I never lied. There is something called the fog of war. This is the German great strategist, Clausewitz, the fog of war, where you don't have all the facts. There's a great deal of uncertainty. It's a rapidly shifting situation. And you can make mistakes simply because you don't have all of the information. But there's a big difference between not, being God in the universe, having all of the information, and deliberately telling a lie. Where we did not have all of the facts, we corrected afterwards. We voluntarily corrected ourselves because our credibility, particularly vis-a-vis the Serbs, was the trust factor. You can trust NATO to tell the truth, to admit
Were you asked to lie? Okay, you can maybe trust Jamie Shea to tell you the truth, not to tell you the entire, if he didn't have information, he wouldn't. Were you asked? Each military we know has a PSYOPs operation, whose aim is to control the information. We also know about that. What about you? Were you asked?
First of all, no. Press is not PSYOPs. There is a massive difference as wide as the Atlantic Ocean between PSYOPs, which is directed against the enemy, the troops of the enemy.
Well, you just told me the messages were for Belgrade, so
yes, but
your information were for the enemy.
Yes, but the political leadership in Belgrade, the message was a message of NATO unity, a message of determination, a message via the Chernomyrdin Ahtisaari process of giving Belgrade a diplomatic way out or climb down, if that is what it wanted to have. But believe me, first of all, if I'd have told a lie, my credibility as the NATO spokesman with the international media would have been lost forever. it's like losing virginity. You can only do it once and you can never recover it. I would never have done that. Secondly, if the only way that you can justify humanitarian intervention is by lying, then you cannot possibly have a humanitarian intervention. The fact is, I didn't need to lie, wouldn't have done it anyway, because we'd honestly, I believe, had justice on our side. We were doing the right thing. We had the overwhelming support of the international community. I was satisfied that we tried diplomacy. We were using force in the minimal way to avoid casualties, to achieve our objectives. Believe me, I totally believed in what we were doing. And where I believed that the information wasn't credible, not because people were lying, but because of the fog of war, I deliberately did not give that information. And in 99.9% of cases, I'm very glad about that, because later on, when we were able to investigate, we found that that information was incorrect.
So since you were the face of that campaign and information, and you were trying to be as just as possible, nevertheless, people in Belgrade saw you as the face of bombs falling in their heads. Have you since been threatened by that side? In the last 20 years, have you had bad experiences because of what you did then and who you spoke for?
Well, no, frankly, no. And I hope that the majority of Serbs today realize that NATO's quarrel was not with the Serb people, but with the Milosevic regime. And I believe, hope, particularly among the younger generation of Serbs, many of whom, by the way, are demonstrating in the streets of Belgrade for more freedom and for more objective media every day. I honestly believe that they see that the Milosevic was their adversary and not just the adversary of the Kosovar people, because he isolated them from Europe, of course, and created a very difficult situation for their country. Of course, I recognize, obviously, that as the NATO spokesman in the campaign, I was never going to be popular in Belgrade. Unfortunately, in conflicts, you pay a price.
Have you gone and visited Belgrade since?
No, I haven't. And I'm quite happy to be, if you like, the man of 20 years ago here. I did my job for NATO at the time.
Would you go if invited?
I would absolutely go if I were invited, but I also generally believe that we're in a new period now, and NATO and Serbia are moving closer together. My old boss at NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, spent many years in Serbia with his father as a UN diplomat, knows Belgrade very well. Serbia is now a member of our Partnership for Peace. We have a military liaison office in Belgrade. We have joint exercises. Okay, Serbia does not at the moment want to join NATO, but it's on track for the EU. So it's not about me. I'm not the story here. I was just one person in one place at one time. The key thing is NATO able to move on? Yes, resoundingly.
Then since you opened this topic, you know, majority of Serbian population today is against NATO membership. You say that they know that NATO campaign was not against them, but all the polling measurements that have been done of the public opinion say that majority of Serbian population is against membership, NATO membership. So what should NATO's strategy be in further developing relations with this country that it bombed 20 years ago?
Well, the answer is that we've held out the hand of friendship. In other words, NATO is never rejecting Serbia. If Serbia doesn't want to join NATO, that's fine. Look at the relationship we have with Finland and Sweden. We have an extremely close relationship with those two Nordic countries.
You didn't bomb Finland and Sweden.
No, but they don't want to join NATO. But they've also understood that even if their population and their political elite at the moment isn't in favor of NATO membership, that doesn't stop them having very, very friendly relations with the alliance. And if you look at Serbia today, okay, it doesn't get the same publicity as when Putin visits Belgrade, as he did a couple of days ago. But we have 5 times more exercises military exercises between NATO and Serbia every year than Russia has with Serbia. We have exercises to deal with things like disaster management and so on. The Secretary General, other NATO officials are frequent visitors. So to my mind, it's not about whether you join NATO or you join the EU. Everybody's free to choose. That's the spirit of the new
Okay,
Europe.
we started the interview with talking about 20 years before. I want to bring you to the current scene. And before I say anything about the region, I want to confess that I really feel sorry for the people of Yemen and Syria who do not see Jamie Shea every day on TV, meaning that the bombs that are falling over their heads and have been in the last years are not those that are coming to save them. So what do you say to people who did not have a NATO intervention saving their lives since? There has not been a humanitarian intervention of such sort since. Why?
Well, clearly NATO is an organization of 29 and with North Macedonia, I hope soon 30 states. And we can only do what our member countries allow us and authorize us to do. NATO cannot act alone. It's, if you like, the collective
determination. Can you explain to audiences why humanitarian intervention is simply not done today?
Well, you need to have a number of factors. First of all, you have to have political leaders in countries who are willing to take the lead. If you think of Kosovo, you had people like Tony Blair in my country, Madeleine Albright in the United States, Clinton and others. So you need political leaders who are determined to do something. Think of Libya, where you had at the time President Sarkozy of France and Prime Minister Cameron of the UK. So first, you need that top-level political leadership. Secondly, you need to have the consensus in the organization. Thirdly, you need a military plan. If I intervene, is it doable? Can I really change the situation? Do I have the troops? Do I have the capabilities to really make a difference and a strategy for that situation? Is it in my interests to intervene? Because it's about humanitarianism, but of course it's also connected with a perception of security interests. The problem, if you like, is that unfortunately we live in a world of multiple conflicts. The United Nations currently counts 50 different conflicts in the world, and NATO, whether we like it or not, can't intervene in every single one everywhere. I'm happy that in Kosovo, those factors, political leadership, a clear plan, a sense of interest, a humanitarian motive, the political will was there. And so I'm glad that we went ahead on that particular occasion. But unfortunately, because you do it in one place, doesn't mean that you automatically are going to find the political will or the capacity to do it everywhere else.
Since you still have fans in this country, if you ask people here, they would be really consider you a contributor to their state and independence. And that's why I want to ask you a trick question now. Are you proud or ashamed or ambivalent about what Kosovo has become today? If you are very honest with us, and as during the NATO bombing, you don't want to lie us, what do you feel about what Kosovo is today?
Well, my honesty, I hope, is much more interesting and convincing than any lies I would come up with. No, I've been a regular visitor to Kosovo. I don't come as often as I'd like to, but I've been many times over the last 20 years. And frankly, I'm proud of what Kosovo has developed into. Every time I come, I see more cars on the roads, which probably you don't like because of the traffic jams, but it's certainly an indication of growing prosperity and normality. I've been involved a little bit with the universities and the higher education sector, both in the private domain and in the state domain, and I've seen spectacular progress in the quality of the universities, the courses, the teaching, the technology, which is important because Kosovo's greatest resource is the 70% of the population under the age of 30 and the brain power, the talents that they will have. I've seen the building of the political institutions, a gradual normalization of politics as well. I see more international banks, international accountancy offices, more modern hotels. So Kosovo is beginning to look and feel more like a normal European country. But of course, it's a young country. It's been in existence only since 2008, not very long. So you cannot expect miracles. It took many, many, many centuries to make Switzerland. Miracles, so I think it's made a lot of progress.
So when you're talking about expectations, did Jamie Shea expect that 2019 Kosovo would be openly and willingly have leaders that would discuss changing of its own borders. Is this something you expected?
Well, this has been a discussion in the Balkans, of course, since the collapse of the former Yugoslavia, and not just in Kosovo. It's been a debate also, of course, in Bosnia and many other places as well. So it's not new. My sense, personally, and I'm giving a personal opinion here, I'm no longer a NATO public servant, is that my hope would be that the countries of the Balkans would remain multi-ethnic European countries, where different communities, like in other European countries, are able to live together and feel at home with open borders with their neighbours, and that would be, to my mind, to be the goal. Of course,
this is not what I asked you. I asked you whether you expected the Kosovo leaders who wanted you to protect us and our territory at that time would today be negotiating that very territory that you fought so much to protect for us to live freely.
Well, my understanding is that there's no negotiation here. From what I see, is there have been various suggestions that have been made, but I haven't yet seen a group from Pristina sitting down with a group from Belgrade with big maps on the table, like we had at the Dayton Peace Conference in 1995.
Why are you so convinced this is not happening behind the scenes?
But I don't know. Well, I think that, to my mind, if I can give my frank view,
yes,
what matters at the moment is to carry on with the normalization of relations between Belgrade and Pristina, the process that was started by High Representative Ashton and continued by High Representative Mogherini from Brussels to normalize things like customs. We have the issue of the tariffs at the moment, that Belgrade keeps commitments made also in terms of energy, the energy market there.
So for how long do you think we should go on with normalization? How long should they last?
Well, please let me answer the question, if I may. If I'm a Kosovar, what am I interested in? Issues of borders, which may happen or may not, but which may not solve the problems, or improving my everyday life, my ability to travel, my ability to access energy, telecommunications, all of these things. And to my mind, what counts is that we focus on this Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, on the things that are really going to improve people's sort of daily lives and be meaningful. Because if you get then that normalization, it's not necessary to change borders. Because why? Because you live perfectly happily together, as we do in Europe.
Well, Jamie, we are in a conundrum.
That's what
we are in a conundrum because normalization has not been showing its fruit. If you are a Kosovar, you say, I'd be wanting energy, I'd be wanting telephone to work. And these are deals that have been signed 7 years ago, and they have not been implemented. So why, as a Kosovar, should you trust that that behind this normalization word, there's actually anybody doing something? Why should you trust the process at all if simple things such as energy and telecom have not been resolved to this day?
I agree, and it's frustrating, particularly after a period in which we made good initial progress. And I do understand also the frustrations of Kosovars, particularly, for example, when they wish to join Interpol and other international organizations and the vote goes against them. And I think it's going to be one of the big tasks of the new EU leadership, which will emerge from the European Union elections in May, to continue that process decisively. Because what matters to me is the normalization of relations between Belgrade and Kosovo, where Belgrade, of course, has to accept the reality that Kosovo is an independent country and should be recognized as such. And that normalization then makes border changes unnecessary, as I've said. On the other hand, the question that Kosovars have to ask is if they start going down the road of border changes, does that really bring a solution? Does that really bring recognition? Does that really bring reconciliation? Because if you change borders, but you don't have these things, it's like, putting a wedding ring on a partner without love. You don't get anything. You have a gesture, but it doesn't bring you what you want. And therefore, to my mind, the key thing is to focus on the fundamentals of what we can do to normalize the relations. As I've said, then border changes are no longer necessary.
Very good questions, and we are pursuing these questions and asking them to our leaders. But at the same time, I would like to put the question back to you. You told me what you personally think. I got that. It's clear. Now, I'm interested to know whether you think that the West are abandoning the principles that have governed its Balkans policy for 30 years. And what do you think, what are the dangers that this poses? Is the West changing its tune in how it viewed the entire region?
I don't believe so. As I've said, you see that in the region, the process of integration is going ahead. Let's look at, for example, what's happened just over in the last couple of weeks with your neighbor, North Macedonia,
yes.
An important country, because your neighbor.
Absolutely.
And the more stable, the more prosperous that is, particularly with the large ethnic Albanian community, the better for you in terms of trade and prosperity. Who would have believed a couple of years ago that Greece would recognize a country called North Macedonia, or that the Macedonians themselves would have been prepared to accept this compromise on the name.
May I just note there, nobody would believe it, but
example.
Does normalization involve having normal leaders? Because don't forget, what happened in Macedonia is that they changed government. The former oppressive prime minister they had, Gruevski, did not reach the normalization agreement with Greece. It was a changed one, a transparent one. You had to have change of leadership, have a normal leader, then have a normalization agreement. So do you think that's what's lacking in Serbia and Kosovo?
Well, I'd simply say that you need to exploit, of course, opportunities, and it does take leadership. There's no doubt about that. But it also means bringing sometimes skeptical populations behind inspired leadership. Look at, obviously the feelings very strong both in Greece and in the North Macedonia. But the thing is that at a time when, unfortunately, so much of Europe, and I'm not just speaking of your region, but so much of Europe is sinking into nationalism, the idea of putting up walls, this obsession with sovereignty and self-identity and breaking apart. It shows that at least in your region, there's been a massive victory in the last couple of days for European values, for integration, for compromise, for diplomacy, for leadership, for reaching out. And that shows that no matter how difficult the problems may seem, there's no such thing as an unsolvable conflict. And I hope that would be an inspiration, particularly as this agreement on the name, as you see, I mentioned this week, the North Macedonian ministers were in Brussels at NATO to sign the accession agreement with NATO. The benefits come very quickly. Montenegro joined NATO very recently. I mentioned the much improved relationship with Belgrade. So it's Albania. Not all negative news. It's not all negative news. No. Albania will begin accession negotiations with the European Union this summer, so that will start the process as well.
It's absolutely not bad news, but you are, I would say, prone to optimism because there's also the other side, the looming Russian influence in Western Balkans. I want to ask you about that. Did you envisage, or maybe you didn't think that far, that in 20 years' time Russians would not be a simple, thirsty 200-member team waiting in an airport, but be actually in rising influence in the Balkans? And how much leverage does Moscow really have in its goal to prevent the Balkan states from joining the Western military alliance? How can NATO counter this?
Well, just look at our record. I mean, for example, how many countries in your region have joined the Commonwealth of Independent States or the Central Security Treaty Organization or Putin's Eurasia Union? I don't see any so far. Whereas, despite obviously Russian attempts to increase influence in the region. I see Montenegro joining NATO, North Macedonia joining NATO, the reconciliation on the name, notwithstanding considerable Russian activities in North Macedonia and in Greece, for example. Albania, as I mentioned, now on the path of EU succession, the EU talking about Serbia joining by 2025. So yes, if you look at the news today, we're Friday here in Brussels, you'll see in the newspapers articles about Russian troll farms and Russian fake news on the internet and trying to interfere. But if you take a step back, particularly over this 20 years, and look at what the general direction has been, it's been overwhelming, 99% of the region coming closer to the NATO, the EU structures, and Euro-Atlantic integration. So if I were President Putin, I certainly would not see that I'm the winner in this process.
How come you wouldn't if you've got two leaders, Mr. Thaci and Vučić, actually sitting down and pushing something that the Russians always wanted, a border change which actually fits what they did in Crimea, and it would fit the Russian ideology in how to deal with conflicts. Why do you think they don't see it this way, that it's precisely the Russian, the possibility of a Russian scenario here is being taken on by Kosovo leaders too?
I generally don't see it that way. I think the fact that President Thaci, I know him very well, of course, and Alexander Vučić are meeting frequently in Brussels, in the region, at different conferences, are discussing things, have this obviously good knowledge of each other by now, and a familiar relationship, is something that would help, because, of course, it means that Belgrade is now dealing with Kosovo.
No, people of Kosovo are pretty nervous about what they're discussing. Is the land swap they're discussing?
No. Look, again, I make a big distinction personally, but also as a former international official, between floating ideas in the air and the type of very, very complicated process of looking at maps, of drawing boundary lines. It's very difficult.
Okay, but do you know that floating ideas in the air also has an effect, the same way the extremists and rightists are floating certain ideas in the air that would be unthinkable before? You don't think that floating such ideas in the air after what we've seen those ideas create in the grounds of Srebrenica, Račak, everything else, that floating those ideas is safe enough?
What I would say is purely that these kind of things obviously can't be done simply by individuals. They have to be done by the parliament. They have to be done by a process of law, which requires a large consultation with civil society. These things are done by nations rather than by individuals. But for my mind, as I've said, and I can only repeat it, the key thing is the normalization of the relations between Belgrade and Pristina in all of the areas that I mentioned. I can mention many others, the court system, the issue of the Association of Serb Municipalities, of course, in the north, and all of those things, which are going to bring about the improvement of daily lives. The borders are not an end in themselves. The fact they are issues of solving normalized relations.
And you don't think this talk creates a domino effect anywhere else in the Balkans, yeah? You don't see a danger from that?
Oh, no, it's not that. But as I've said before, my sense is that the countries of the Balkans want a European future. And a European future means that we live happily in multi-ethnic, tolerant, liberal societies. And it's not a question of putting borders up, it's a question of taking borders down, having borders opening up all the time, making borders irrelevant. When I drive my car to the Netherlands, I cross the border between Belgium and the Netherlands at 160 kilometers an hour. I don't even know there's a border. And that's what Europe is all about. It's not getting into borders, it's getting out of borders through greater normalization. And so wherever this debate leads, for me, what counts is just keeping this Pristina-Belgrade dialogue going to produce practical, tangible benefits for people on both sides, which is honestly, I think, what ultimately people want.
Yes, the people just can't wait forever for this to forever to continue happening and pay for our trips of our leaders to just continue flying to Brussels without any results. What do you say to those people who think it's futile, we're wasting our public funds just doing this?
Well, Winston Churchill famously said that jaw, which is English slang for talking, is better than war. And you look at Greece and Northern Macedonia, who've been talking also for many, many, many years. But this process is important in order to understand each other better, to find areas of agreement and compromise and reach results. But we need to keep it up. It produced some good results over the last few years, but we need to continue it.
I share with you, and I think many people here share the excitement that of North Macedonia joining NATO and the crucial role that the Albanian community has played in helping this. And we really hope they spread the virus in Serbia and Kosovo in terms of reaching somewhere. But now I want to also ask you about the end of the interview that I read in an interview you did with my colleagues in Bern in 2017, that you were not then a proponent of Kosovo having an army. You said instead Kosovo has to focus on building schools and universities. Well, since then, with the US backing, Kosovo has transformed this Kosovo security force into an army. What do you think of Kosovo having an army? Do you still believe it shouldn't have had an army?
No, let me say what I think now. I certainly am not backtracking from what I said in 2017. As I've said, I think for governments, particularly in Kosovo, the focus is on improving the lives of the population and improving jobs and improving education. They are the key things, particularly if there is no security threat that demands a big change in policy, and bearing in mind that Kosovo is in a very privileged situation because it's protected every day of the week by 5,000 NATO troops. And there are some NATO countries, frankly, which would be very happy to have 5,000 NATO troops on their territory today. So Kosovo is a country which is internationally protected, and NATO has done that for 20 years and continues to do that. I understand that as a state, it's the aspiration of states to have their own armed forces. And I really had 2 points. The first point, which is a NATO point, but which I agree with, is that this should be done through constitutional means. So it brings in all of the communities and societies so that Kosovo forces would be as multi-ethnic as the Kosovo police service has developed, which is a good example. Through constitutional means.
Sorry, JB, has NATO asked the same multi-ethnic criteria from every other country it joined?
Absolutely. If you look at, for example, what we in Bosnia, although Bosnia is not a member of NATO, we reformed the armed forces in such a way that it became a force with Croats.
Are you asking the same of Macedonia?
And Serbs.
No, let's say, are you asking Macedonia to have 30% Albanians in its force?
Of course, the North Macedonia has to decide these things, but it is absolutely fundamental that an army has to be a reflection of its society to command a popular and public
Yes, but you just allowed North Macedonia to join without these criteria really fulfilling.
No, we have doing a lot of work with Northern Macedonia, and particularly on military form, and that process will continue. But in the long run, all security forces, whether police or military, need to reflect the composition and the culture and the nature of the state to command public service. I come from Ireland, and we had a big problem in Ireland for many years where the police service in the north was dominated by the Protestant community and was therefore not seen as something that the Catholic community could associate itself with. And since we've created a multi-community police service in Northern Ireland with Catholics and Protestants reflecting the society, the degree of authority and acceptance of that police force has been much, much, much higher.
But on this criteria, can I just ask for your advice here? KSF Kosovo, the Kosovo new army is trying right now, has got a lot of recruited Serbs. It's trying to recruit Serbs. It recruited Serbs, and they were recently arrested in borders. They're members of members of Serbian community who join KSF are being arrested and intimidated by Serbian state and seen as traitors. So why should Kosovo forever be a hostage to this attitude of Serbia, just to fulfill this standard which is trying, but Serbia is obstructing this?
Well, I can't obviously comment on every single incident and of course, regret every setback which exists. Again, as I said earlier, it's too easy sometimes to become the prisoner of the day-to-day incidents and frustrations and be dominated by those. And I think what counts for Kosovo is having a long-term sense of strategic direction and sticking to it. But to my mind, two things need to be said. The first thing is that having security forces, police armed forces, which reflect the society, also says to these communities that they are real citizens. That they have a place in that society, because they can also be part of the essence of the state, which is the security forces. So it's a very powerful message that you're welcome, you have a place here, you are as much a citizen as I am as well. And they also, of course, then help that process of integration to come along. The armed forces can often be in a central role. So my mind is, instead of getting into a kind of tit for tat all of the time, what Kosovo needs to do is simply have this long-term objective and stick to it, to demonstrate again that it fully shares the European values.
In this long-term objective, when can you see the KSF forces, Kosovo security forces, be a member of international missions, join in as a partner in international missions?
Well, what we found in NATO is, for example, if I can give the example of Bosnia, is that after NATO worked very hard to develop the Bosnian armed forces, they started to go on UN peacekeeping operations with their partners of the region in places like Lebanon in the UNIFIL mission. And I remember the Secretary General at the time, who was a big friend of Kosovo, of course, George Robertson, saying that this was great because Bosnia had gone from being a consumer of security to being a provider of security by bringing security to other people in other countries. And I hope that the Kosovo security forces, as they are consolidated, will have the opportunity to work with countries of the region, other NATO member states in these broader international security tasks.
What does KSF have to do to be taken into international missions? What would you say are 3 top things they have to do?
Well, first of all, of course, to have quality units that are interoperable, that are trained to meet the standards and which can play a useful role. Secondly, to develop security partnerships, because as I mentioned, these units are often folded into multinational divisions or multinational headquarters of other countries. So to develop some very, very close partners as well. But thirdly, of course, and I have to be frank in the case of Kosovo, the recognition issue, of course, is going to play on this. And I hope that with the normalization between Belgrade and Pristina, finally, we can overcome this recognition issue and have all of the members of NATO, all of the members of the EU recognize Kosovo, which would then facilitate, of course, the participation in these type of missions. But again, the key thing is to keep a long-term objective and stick with it and not be constantly blown left or blown right. It's so easy by the sort of the frustrations or the incidents of the day.
Finally, what are you most proud of in your career, Jamie, having now retired? Can you name 3 of the most proud moments for you?
Well, I'm not pretending that I've got anything particularly to be proud about. I've always considered that what I tried to do was to do my job, to do it professionally and to do it well. Of course, I am proud of what happened in 1999. We had a difficult time. We had a lot of skepticism that we would succeed, as you know, were we doing the right thing? And I generally really am glad that NATO was able to stop the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, learn the lessons of Bosnia, which were very, very tragic indeed, and then, of course, introduce the troops to bring peace to Kosovo. Again, it's not perfect, but in this world, nothing is perfect. But I generally think that that was a good thing to be associated with. Second thing I'm proud of is I've been a university teacher all my life, and now I have thousands of students all around the world today who have taken my European security class. Many are diplomats, many are in the armed forces, many work for NGOs or humanitarian organizations, and hopefully they will spread the word of liberalism, democracy, multinationalism against the populists and the nationalists and the sovereigntists that I was talking about earlier, and I'm proud of that as well. And finally, I'm proud that I managed to bring up two children who have both reached the age of 30 and are considerably more intelligent than I am, and that's all that a parent ever really wants.
And for the end, I just thank you, because what you've said in the beginning, the one thing you're proud of is the thing that I'm sure I wouldn't be over dramatic in saying that I believe I wouldn't be alive if NATO bombing did not happen, and I would not be having the two children that I have if NATO bombing did not happen. So I'm happy that I share that proudness with you. You made, it's not about being proud, it's actually you made the existence of my family and the future of my family happen with that bombing. You contributed to it. Clearly the leaders that decided were key. I share that with you. Thank you for being in Jeta and Kosovo.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and good luck to you and good luck to Kosovo.